You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Daniel Schepis, a senior lecturer and researcher in marketing at the University of Western Australia Business School. His research focuses on the study of business networks in the context of industries, especially in regards to the management of these networks and how information can spread in them. I'm very excited to learn more about this modern discipline and its applications today. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very much looking forward to learning about this area that I never have looked into before. And to get started with this, I'd just love to ask you a little bit about yourself, your story, what you're doing right now, and how you got started in this area of work.
Yep, certainly. So thanks for having me on your podcast. So my name's Daniel Schepis. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Western Australia in Perth, Australia. And this is the city I've been born in, and I studied at this university, and I've been based here basically all my life. So I've been a lecturer for the past 7 years after finishing my PhD. So I'm in the marketing school, but my research mainly focuses on the area of business networks and I guess understanding how that applies to different business problems, whether that's innovation or contracting or social impact or board interlocks and things like that. So I have a few technical skills which I sort of apply to different problems, and I collaborate with a few scholars around the world actually. So depending on what topic we're looking at, that's how I sort of apply. But I guess, so it's quite eclectic, but what keeps it all together is most of my research projects tend to have something to do with networks in various forms. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when I was looking through your research papers, it was a very new thing for me to actually understand what networks meant in this context in the first place, because usually when someone not familiar with this would look into it, it's like you think of your personal network, like, okay, you connect with this person in a one-to-one relationship setting. But when it comes to these business networks, I saw that you were working with networks of all sizes, from industrial networks, like entire companies working together, to the thing you just mentioned within an individual board. And I was wondering, to start off, when it comes to what we mean in this context by networks, could you talk about some of the different types of networks involved there, the different scales, and what kind of features that we study that unite these different networks?
Yeah, great question to start with. So basically, when you're studying networks, you use very similar principles to study any type of network. And that doesn't even have to be, social network between humans. It could be more of an ecological network. Some people also look at more like technology networks, so linking between machinery and things like that. And even in the interaction between them as well. So how humans may be linked to machines or even to the natural life and things like that. So broadly, yeah, there's a study of networks across many different disciplines. Something I guess that I tend to focus on is mostly social networks, which are actually quite similar to our own personal networks. So you have different types of relationships with other people, and same companies have different relationships with other companies. So that could be suppliers, that could be their customers, that could be their shareholders, a variety of different types of connections you might have. Broadly, with the study of networks, you want to understand a few things, which is firstly, probably what is the structure of the network? So what does it actually look like? Who is connected to who? And probably at that point, you also want to understand or define who is within this network and who is not. So some sort of boundary, because they tend to be quite boundless, okay? And that's fine, but when we do research, we want to try and set a specific limit so we don't study every possible thing in the world. The other aspect of it is, what is the nature of the relationships? So not necessarily just who is connected to who, but what does that connection mean? Okay, does that carry certain types of reputation flows? Does it improve trust? Does it help to share information? These sort of properties, which we try and understand. So depending on what is your aim of the research, that sort of tends to be what you try and focus on. And in terms of the level, the size, that again relates back to the research question. So my bigger project where I use sort of quite a large network, I'm looking at a project with all the companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, of which there's over 1,000, and the connections between different boards of these firms. On a smaller scale, I've looked at projects of startups within a small startup incubator, or I've looked at connections between school students or university students as well. So that's sort of within a classroom. So the network would be within the classroom. So the scale really depends on that.
Hmm. And when you're analyzing social relationships in this context, I know there are a few keywords that we can talk about when it comes to network effectiveness and network efficiency. And all of these things seem kind of abstract in terms of, say, information flow, etc. So it would be great if you could summarize what those two key terms mean, and then why is it important to study these things about how does information flow, how do the incentives of the network come together to achieve a goal, etc.
Yeah, great. So I guess the beauty of networks is on the topic of efficiency is not everybody has to be connected to each other in order to receive the same information. Okay. So you could be linked to certain bridging ties, so people who are connected to many people, and through them you can access other people or other firms. Okay. So how easy it is to access people in different parts of the network who you're not connected to would be a sign of efficiency. And say you're in a big supply chain, for instance, and you want to receive some sort of critical information, having the ability to access through other managers or other companies certain information elsewhere would make it more efficient, right? The opposite of that is to have a big structural hole where there is a certain group of people who have very critical information, but you have no way to access it because there's no connections, or you have to go through multiple different people, in which case the information may break down or take too long or whatever. Effectiveness is a slightly different aspect, is you look at the end goal in which it's trying to achieve. So it may be still quite messy for whatever reason, maybe some historic reasons why certain people are connected in certain ways, but it still does the job quite well. Okay, so it could be fairly amount of, a lot of connections could be quite redundant. You didn't need that many, so it's not that efficient, but it's important for building trust, for instance, in which case that trust might be really important to achieving the end goal. Okay, so that becomes pretty important when we talk about innovation, because if we think about startups, they might be working on something which isn't yet commercialized. So the technology they're working on might be quite sensitive. They want to be cautious with how they share their knowledge before they can actually make money of it. So things like trust and people's reputation become quite important properties within our network analysis.
Mm-hmm. And when we start to think about this kind of science, I know I was trying to understand what is this thing called network science. I'd never heard of it, but it was very astonishing for me to realize this actually went back hundreds of years when it came to just a mathematical depiction of how network theory worked. But I think in the 1930s, we started to see sociologists start to study networks and their implications. And then from there, I know you were mentioning earlier how you can look at it in the context of ecology. And we've actually been interviewing some very interesting scientists that study networks in social animals, like in primates or let's say ants, and they have very specific behavior. And I was just thinking about all of the interdisciplinary nature of this kind of work when it comes to all of these different contexts that you can study networks in, and just thinking about all of these different aspects that we try to study in modern day sociology, where we're trying to analyze people's information. I know when we look at, say, digital networks like social media, there's a lot of work going into what kind of information is being spread, thinking about things like political influences, etc., etc. And it's just kind of mind-boggling for me to consider how this one kind of science can offer insights in all of these very, very different, seemingly different areas. So I was wondering, in your personal experience, do you find that, I know you talked about how you kind of work in many different areas, but networks relate them all. Do you find that you're often working at the heart of interdisciplinary research and you often have to, in your personal experience, pick up different skills from different disciplines to combine them together in this field of study?
Yes, absolutely. That's definitely true. So even within business, I consider myself quite interdisciplinary. So I work with some colleagues in finance. So I'm looking at trying to understand the networks, and they are contributing with the implications of that as it relates to share price or something like that. Especially in business, we're not developing most of these network tools. We're just sort of applying them in new ways to new problems. And when we're doing that, we're sort of adding new light to that. Really great part of interdisciplinary research is a couple of years ago, I became familiar with some of the ways in which people in geography study the idea of proximity. So how close people or companies could be to each other, and what does that mean? And I stumbled across a very nice theory for that, which had sort of 5 different dimensions of proximity. And then I was able to, in a recent paper, apply that in a different way to try and look at how startups become closer to their eventual clients, which is the large firms within an innovation network. And that was pretty good because they would study these 5 dimensions in one way, and I used the same definitions but applied it in a new way. Because I'm a qualitative researcher, so I like to ask people their stories and explain their path for, how did their company emerge, or how did they start to work with this company in particular, and from there work backwards to try and identify some of these dimensions of proximity. So what made them closer to another firm, even if that firm's on the other side of the world, that enable them to develop a relationship, to do business together, or develop an idea together. So I think it's a very rich area for interdisciplinary research, especially if we think about some of the more hard sciences, or maths are excellent at actually measuring and analyzing these networks, especially at a grand scale. And people at my end, social humanities side, are quite good at explaining what some of these connections mean, or some of the changes in the network. What are the implications of that, and what might make something change, or what is the nature of a relationship? That's really what I'm passionate about, is not just explaining the structure of a network, but looking at sort of the underlying meaning and using that to sort of address some real world problems.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to these problems, I know I was looking at a few of your research papers around recently social impact markets, and then a while back with pubs, as you suggested. And I was wondering about the kind of link between theoretical research that you see on what kind of phenomena we see in a network, like what kind of behaviors we see with different agents in the network, and then with your role coming in to explain that, use qualitative methods to kind of get at the underlying mechanisms behind that. But then once you've done all of this theoretical research, I found it really interesting to consider some of the practical ways that this could be applied to help businesses in real time, like actually make use of these networks or find ways to come together to achieve collective goals more efficiently. So I'd love to hear about those case studies of what you've been working on there.
Yeah, I can give you an example of a recent, well, it was not that recent, but it's recently published. So I did a study of innovation hubs, or innovation, I call them innovation intermediaries. So that is sort of organizations that try and help startups or large companies connect together. And I looked at a case study within the mining and oil and gas industry, and I visited a few of these different hubs in Australia, Chile, USA, and Canada, and looking at how they're connected between each other. So they are performing certain activities in tandem to help their members. So their members tend to be local startups. So when we have an industry like mining, oil and gas, it's a very large industry, but it's very clustered around the world. So wherever these resources are, that's where you tend to find the large firms who are extracting these resources, and they might be the ones who startups need as investors or clients. So that creates quite a lot of challenge as to how do you actually meet the managers who would be approving a trial, for instance, or how do you begin to access the data you need to develop your machine learning algorithm, whatever that might be, especially if you're on the other side of the world and you've got no mutual connections between them. So these hubs are kind of filling in these gaps. So I looked at how they work locally, what sort of things they do within their local ecosystem, business ecosystem, to improve connections between different types of firms. Okay, so they might be holding hackathons, they might be setting up, networking drinks, they could be running educational workshops, they could be setting up site trials, whatever these things might be. These different activities are helping firms come together and increasing the chances that they would meet, develop relationships, and then maybe commercialize their products. We know that these types of activities are useful. That's what they provide to the members, but I'm trying to understand from a theoretical perspective, what is changing in the network when they do these activities, and how can they maybe, categorize them? So I understand, okay, we maybe lack a bit of common understanding. Let's focus on these sort of educational workshops so that the different managers understand the other's perspective and makes it easier for them to work together. Or this company wants to sort of work with some oil and gas firms and they're all based in Houston. How can we provide them connection to another innovation intermediary in Houston who can then link them to their members who might be, in need of that technology? So there's a lot of practical implications from this, and pointed to there's a lot of space for them to develop more mutually beneficial collaborations to better connect firms across the world.
And I think what you just mentioned in terms of the perspective side of things is very essential here, because just from the outside looking in, it kind of seems like when you understand the power of networks and how humans can collaborate together more effectively, not just at the level of, this is Mark, this is Bob, put them together, but at the levels of entire organizations and industries with thousands and thousands of people. It's like being able to think from that perspective. It offers a lot of unique insights that I think a bunch of business leaders often try to gain, in terms of not just thinking about their day-to-day operations like as they were in a startup context, but then transitioning to large organizations and thinking about the ramifications of all of their decisions every day. And it kind of seems like if you have someone come in who has this kind of knowledge, who has this kind of training to think from the level of how do all of these interactions come together and be able to influence each other to achieve this particular outcome, and what are the factors that influence that. It's like a really fundamental perspective shift, even in the context of someone who can't do this or hasn't trained themselves to try to analyze this. It might just like seem like magic. And in your perspective, have you noticed that when you're having conversations with people in these industries or with business leaders, that you are able to say, look at a problem they're having, and then in your head you're just like breaking it down? Okay, this is the network level and here are the interactions happening together, whereas someone else without your experience might not be able to see that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure to what level I can sort of break down what they're thinking, but definitely when I'm speaking to them, I always have a different lens on. So they're telling me things which seem quite clear to them and make sense. But I'm thinking about this, okay, you're describing some challenges you have with connecting to managers in a large company that might be due to too many gatekeepers, or could be that these managers have different priorities, or maybe these managers perceive you to be too risky or unfamiliar, and these sort of things, which then relate back to some network properties. So I think that's what I do. Whether that's specifically helpful or not, I'm not sure. But I know that some people in industry, in every industry, especially even in research, are just fundamentally very good at connecting people, and they do that quite naturally. Maybe they don't even think that that's deliberately about what they're doing, but they're able to, without having too much deep knowledge of a certain field or industry, be able to take enough from a conversation to link that to another person's field or domain and say, this might be relevant for you, or I heard this opportunity or this challenge, and I can then connect the dots. And I think there's a lot of successful people in industry and academia, and that's primarily why they're successful. They can link one idea to a different problem, which people who have deeper knowledge in those domains might not be familiar with or might not consider right away because they don't think that way. So the difference between like specialists and generalists for that, in that sense. And perhaps you might be a good example of that, doing this podcast, speaking to people in very different fields, but being able to have conversation with them about their topics, and then perhaps relate that to completely different people's topics and fields. So maybe that's sort of a skill that you're developing through this podcast as well.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to consider it from that lens, like consider the individual behaviors of people involved. And that's what I think is so cool about being able to apply network science to social problems. You know, when you have nodes in a computer network, it's pretty easy, you know how it's going to behave, but then you have all of the complexities of a human. And I just find it incredible that you can still take this kind of science and apply it. In regards to what you just said, it reminds me a lot of things that personality type psychologists study. I think definitely like there are some connections here going from the micro scale to the macro scale. If you were able to have a conversation with a psychologist who perhaps really understands people's behaviors in terms of their social thinking patterns and being able to connect things and build from that to your understanding where that's one person who's a node in a network, how does that change the results that are going to happen at a larger scale? And I think that's really interesting. And it kind of gets to the last area of questions I wanted to ask about, which are
Sure.
about what happens when you think about the broader scale implications of this kind of research, and especially what happens in the future. Because as with any industry, I'm sure there are a bunch of known unknowns where you know that there are some limitations in certain theories that we have in network science, and there are some gaps in research. But I'd also love to ask you about, in addition to that, some of the areas where you intuitively think there has been not enough attention going to them. They've been understudied, and there might be new discoveries waiting out there that we can't even conceptualize right now when it comes to the future of network science.
Yeah, so I'll answer that maybe specifically to my area, which I think is sort of an emerging area, but an area where we're still trying to adapt to the needs of industry and the world. Is I'm quite interested in the topic of sustainability, and a lot of companies increasingly, whether they're forced to by shareholders or government, or they're changing their mindset, are more interested in sustainability. So that area of blending profit-driven companies with sustainable goals, and in that case, maybe some NGOs or other firms which are more focused on sustainability, and these then contrasting or competing goals from a network perspective, what sort of activities or behaviors must we see within this network to get that working efficiently and effective? So I think that's a big area that I hope to work in the near future, particularly because whenever you're mixing types of companies or any sorts of actors or nodes which are just very different and behave in very different ways, it tends to create a lot of challenges from a network perspective. More broadly, I think as long as other social scientists continue to be interested in this area, I think I'd like to see greater complexity being introduced into sort of social network analysis and network analysis topics. It's quite easy, like you said, to draw clean lines between two nodes. And to an extent, we do that to make it easier to research. But if we think about personal relationships or even business relationships, they're extremely complex. They don't behave always in the way we think they might. There's a lot of history within them and various aspects which make a single connection extremely complicated. So if we want to make our analysis more meaningful, we have to work out ways in which we can introduce some of this complexity into the research. I think that is hopefully a very interesting avenue for future research.
Yeah, it seems like there are lots of ripe connections when it comes to integrating all of these assumptions from, say, economics and studying incentives to psychology and studying people's behaviors, and then work all that all the way up to the level of networks as a whole. And I think from just an initial conversation, it sure seems like there's a lot of room for that to grow. And I think it'll be really great to see the kinds of results that we start to see when it comes to network science advancing in these areas, taking in these different disciplines and trying to combine all of these different layers to a more nuanced analysis as a whole. So I'm going to be very much looking forward to keeping up to date with what happens in this area of work. And finally, I just wanted to ask you, if someone was more curious to learn about your work, where might they go?
Well, good question. I have some papers available, but if you're not necessarily in academia, you might find I hope to be publishing some more easier to understand, shorter articles on my LinkedIn and hopefully set up a blog soon if I can manage to get a bit more time. But up to now, yeah, you can read some of my conference papers and my published journal articles online if you can access that through the library. If not, just send me an email and I'll happily send that to you.
All right, that sounds great. I'll be glad to put some of those links in the description. And I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to join me today and provide all of this insight on this enormously complicated but very cool discipline.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.